Alright, I did some things to lessen the footprint of the Naomi. So this is the first less messy version, although looking at it, it actually looks pretty much about as messy as the first version. I'll go over some of the changes I did and why, even though it looks messy, it's actually less messy. First thing is the power supply. I'm now running on a PC power supply. This is a Thermaltake 500 watt power supply I borrowed from a friend of mine. It's not modular power supply, so it has all these cables that I don't need. What I've done is I've made a ATX to JVS power adapter with spare connectors that I had on hand, plus a motherboard connector I got off eBay, shipped for like $8.20. It's ATX to mini ATX for Dell's, converting a standard power supply to work with Dell Optiplex. I bought it because it had the right wire colors. I didn't notice that it was missing one wire. If you can see the blue wire there, that's one of the 3.3 volt wires. It should be orange, but it was not populated, so I took the blue, which is negative 12 volts. I pulled it out of the harness because the Naomi doesn't use negative 12, and I put it into the spot for the 3.3 volts. So it's pulling 3.3 volt from the ATX power supply on 4 different lines. So 4 orange lines are 3.3 volts, 2 yellow lines are 12 volts, and 5 red wires actually are 5 volts. Down there on the Naomi, you can see I've got multimeter leads stuck in it right now. My wire colors I kind of screwed up on the left-hand connector. The yellow and brown should be swapped left to right, but that's just the way that I connected them to the wires. The wires are correct, where there is 3.3 volt on the left and 5 volt on the right. So I've got the right voltages and colors going in. It's just I connected them up to the wrong wires that came out of those connectors I had. I've only got 9 pins for those connectors, and those pins have been out of stock at DigiKey forever. So you need 10 wires to go into those connectors, and I only had 9 crimp pins, so I just decided to take the 2 housings I had that still had some original wiring in them, cut the original wiring off about 1.5 inches long, and then stripped the ends down to the bare wire, and then took the matching wires from the adapter from the ATX power supply, stripped the wires there, and put these connectors on that I got from a friend years ago and put in the garage and frankly hadn't used. They're actually clear shrink tube. You can see some blue. The blue is the color they put on the shrink tube so you can designate size, different colors. The shrink tubing came in several sizes: red, blue, white, and I think yellow, for different gauge wires. And then in the middle you can see the silver area. That's actually solder. So these are basically clear shrink tube with solder in the middle. So line up your wires so the wires are in the middle section there, and hit them with a heat gun, and it shrinks the tubing around the wires and it melts the solder. And I was dubious, but it seems to have worked really well. I looked under magnification, and I can definitely see the wires are in the solder, embedded in the solder, so it did stick to the wires, and it seems to be working fine so far. I have a voltmeter here. Let me push the wire in. It's not quite making good contact. So just over 3.3 volts on 3 volt line. and just over 5 volts on the 5 volts. Really happy about that. So the voltages seem to be good. Another advantage of this is it has an on-off switch on the PC power supply. The Sun power supply does not. So with the Sun power supply, I had to physically unplug the power supply from the outlet to turn it off and plug it in to turn it on, whereas this one actually has an on-off switch, which is another modification done to this harness. Wire, I think it's 13, is a wire that goes to a power switch in a PC. So you take wire 13 and 14, 14 being the ground, 13 being green wire, you tie them together, and that's as if the power switch on the PC is turned on. So that means that as soon as the power supply comes on, it senses that that connection is made, and it thinks that you're running this on a PC with the power button turned on, and so the power supply immediately comes on. Otherwise, even though the switch on the power supply was on, you could make a switch between the green and the black wires, and that would turn the power supply on. So if you want to put it in an arcade cabinet like this, that's one thing you could do, is run the black and the green to a switch and then put that outside the cabinet, so when you turn the cabinet on, it makes the power supply come on. Another thing I've done, apart from this 24-pin motherboard header on the power supply, I'm using one 4-pin Molex connector. 4-pin Molex connector is red, which is 5 volts, black, which are ground, yellow, which is 12 volts. So I have a few spare housings, and I have pins, and so I made an adapter that has 2 different wires going to 5 volts, 2 different wires that are going to ground. One of them I put a micro USB connector on, and it's powering the Raspberry Pi. The other one I put a barrel tip connector on to power the VGA to HDMI adapter. Now the problem is, this is my first test running all this. This barrel connector is either not quite the right diameter, or it's too long or not long enough, or something's causing it where if you wiggle the wire, the power to the adapter goes on and off, and it's not my soldering of the 2 wires in here. The red wire goes to the center of this plug, and the ground wire goes to the outside, so it's positive voltage in the tip and negative voltage on the outside. So it's wired up properly, it's just wiggling it, it's not making contact, so it might not be deep enough or something, or the inside of the outside barrel is the right size, but the inside maybe is a little bit too large, so it's not making good enough contact with the pin inside the adapter. So that's kind of a bummer, but I might be able to fix that. So for now, I've got the adapter plugged into an outlet. The JVS I is now being powered by the Naomi. So this pin header on the Naomi filter board provides 5 volts and ground. 5 volts on 2 pins, ground on 2 other pins. That was going to my compact flash unit to power my compact flash unit, but now that this setup is using the Raspberry Pi, that was a free location to pull 5 volts. I did not want to power the Raspberry Pi from that, just because I haven't looked at the specs, but I'm pretty sure the Raspberry Pi is pulling more voltage than the compact flash unit was. So I hooked it up to the JVS I, which admittedly I didn't look at how much power that draws either, but I figured it's got to be less than a Raspberry Pi. And I figured that this adapter here is using 5 volts at 1 amp. So it probably could have gone in either one of these. Again, I'm not sure about the Raspberry Pi, but it probably could have run either one of these, but I figured just off the top of my head that this is the one that might use less power, and so less of a stress on the actual Naomi itself to run that off there. Then me making yet another connector that pulls 5 volts from another one of these. I'm not going to take this apart now that I've got 2 wires in there. It's all crimped up. It's working great. So if I needed to do that, I'd have to pull 5 volts from another one of these white Molex connectors. But it seems to be working fine, like I said, other than the barrel tip that I used to make an adapter for that VGA to HDMI adapter having a problem. So it's move a couple boxes over here before I show what we're saving here. So like I said, this still is a mess of wires, etc. But let me scroll over here and show what it's actually saving. What it's saving is half of this sun power supply, because the PC power supply is a little more than half of the depth of this one. It's the exact same width, but it's shorter in height. But the main thing is it's almost half the size of this giant metal box here. Now, I opened this box up because I was shining a flashlight in it trying to see why is this box so big, because when you look online for sun power supplies for the Naomi, they're about the same size as a standard power supply. And I'm like, okay, why did this one that was supposed to have come from a House of the Dead 2, why is this so darn big? So I opened it up because I wanted to look inside it just to make sure it was still clean and everything, because I got it years and years ago, and I had taken the top off and I'd cleaned everything off and used a soft bristle brush and made sure I got all the dust off of it I could, which it was nasty, and I cleaned up the fan. I might have even replaced the fan. But anyway, I looked inside, and yeah, the PCB that's in here that supplies the power actually goes to about 1.5 inches from the end of this metal box. So it is huge. It's much larger than these, what I guess I would call the standard sun power supply that you see people using with a Naomi. And I think it might have something to do with the fact that House of the Dead 2 was an early, if not the release title for the Naomi, and this power supply might have been from the prior generation Sega arcade system, which I can't remember off the top of my head if that would be Sega Model 2 or something else. But I'm thinking that maybe that they had these, and so these are what they used, even though later they realized they didn't need that much voltage, or they hadn't yet manufactured the other power supplies. So I was going to look online just out of curiosity to see the power ratings of the smaller sun power supply. But just for reference, the output on this is 12 amps on the 3.3 volt line, 5 volt, also 12 amps, and 2 amps on the 12 volt line. So I'll have to go online and just out of curiosity compare that with the shorter sun power supply just to see, because this thing is, it just seems like way overkill compared to the smaller sun power supply. For reference, this is upside down, but this one is what, 22 amps on the 3.3. I can't read that because it's upside down. It's really small writing. But basically, this one is just way overkill for what you would need on a Naomi. I've heard of people running the Naomi on 160 watt power supplies. So this just happens to be one that my friend had handy to loan me, so I could do this test of my cable to make sure my cable adapter was working. So that's why it's a 500 watt when it doesn't need to be. Although now that I've got it together like this, again back over to here, you can see all these cables here. This cable is AC out that goes to the Sega audio amp that came with this power supply, that's also in a large metal box instead of the one that you sometimes see with a Naomi setup that has the round toroid transformer. I believe that's the transformer on the audio amp. So this is AC out that goes to that. This is AC in that I wired to a PC power cord that I cut the end off and put connectors on. This is for extra voltages, and then because this was in a US cabinet, it looks like it's been hacked. There's several wires that are cut on one of these connectors. Down here I can see a bunch of cut wires, and then obviously it's been hacked up here from the look of it because it terminates in US connectors. Unless, I've never had a House of the Dead 2 cabinet, so maybe that's the way they came in the US, terminated to Molex, because Molex is so much more common in the US than the Japanese type connectors. But anyway, yeah, it terminates down here in the two connectors that, like I said, I have some of these housings. I don't have any of the 8-pin housings, and I only have 9 of the pins that go inside. Another interesting thing to note, since I'm talking about the power supply here, if you see this connector, the white ground lines are all the way across this connector. So 4 ground lines on the bottom and 3 ground lines on the bottom of this. But the one I made, the ground wires are only on 3 pins on the right and the bottom 2 pins on the left connector. That's the way that connector, that is the way that this connector was in my spare wiring. So it was, I don't think it ever had those extra grounds. So I've seen adapters you can buy for the Naomi that are this exact same setup. Some of them have ground wires in those bottom extra slots, and some of them don't. But I know that it runs okay without them. Also, if you put a multimeter on the pins in the Naomi that match up to the grounds, they're all connected together. So not having a ground in there doesn't mean that something's not getting a ground. It's just an extra spot for a ground wire. So again, perhaps whatever system this power supply was actually intended for when it was made maybe uses more power, and that's why they've got even an additional ground wired up here than is necessary to run a Naomi. So that pretty much covers the power supply. So it's kind of, like I said, it's kind of a trade-off right now, simply because the new power supply is a lot shorter, but this one still has this bunch of clunky wires, and this one has like even more wires because none of these Molex headers other than the one is being used. So a modular power supply would be the way to go, because then you could just, even if it's modular where the motherboard connector comes out and is not modular, but the rest of these SATA power and standard PC power plugs come out, if those were module, I would only have one populated, and then the motherboard, and that would be the extent of the wiring here, instead of having a big bunch of wires in there that I don't need. So I really think I do want to go to a modular power supply, but finding one that's low voltage is probably going to be hard, and I don't want to spend a lot of money because I shouldn't need to. There's enough power supplies out there in the world that are just fine, that are fairly cheap. So even if I have to get a 500 or 450 or even bigger power supply, if I can get one that's modular, I think that's the way to go, unless I decide to put the power supply in a case. If I put the power supply in a case and the I/O board in the case and the Pi in a case, so then I have the Naomi and a case instead of the Naomi on a board with a bunch of stuff on it, then it wouldn't matter if I had the wires coming off. So it's still kind of something I'm trying to figure out. But the main reason I wanted to borrow this from a friend, since I didn't have a spare power supply that's not in a PC right now, is just to make sure that my adapter works and everything runs okay and the voltages were good, which they were. So on to what I'm saving here. This I am not saving. This is a barrel connector for the HDMI, the VGA to HDMI box. This one is actually goes with my less expensive of the two. This one I got off Amazon, and this one I got from Fry's before they went out of business. This is the one that was really stupid expensive because this one didn't work converting a Naomi to work on a television set that I had when I was messing around with my Naomi running gun games. So I tried this on my computer monitor and it also didn't work. So I swapped back to the expensive one. And then I realized that I had that barrel plug wasn't fitting tight, and these both use the same barrel plug. They're both 5 volt 1 amp. So I think that maybe this one might not have been working because that barrel plug was not making good contact. Again, you might be able to see in there what it consists of is on the middle there's a pin, and so that goes through the middle of the barrel connector, and that's, in this case, gets positive voltage. And then down in the bottom there's a little, you can see a little metal tab that pushes up on the outside of the barrel connector and gets ground. So I'm thinking that maybe that pin is too small, so even though my barrel connectors that I just happen to have on hand from some other project, even though they have the right diameter on the outside so they fit in snugly in these plugs, they don't have the right diameter for the center pin, so it's too big and it's not making good contact. So this still might work on my computer monitor. I'm not 100% sure, but as long as this one's working, I got one good working one, that's a plus. So I'm not saving that power connector, but what I am saving is this power connector. This, showed my previous video, is a Radio Shack adjustable power supply with 3, 5, 6, 9, 7.5, and 12 volts. So you move this switch to whatever voltage you want, and that's what comes out of it. It's 2.5 amps of power, and it has replaceable tips. And this tip right here, I just recently bought, is a micro USB. So set this for 5 volts. Put a micro USB, and I also have a USB-A, standard USB end that I can put on, as well as some barrel tips. But yeah, this adjustable power supply was powering my Raspberry Pi, and now that's out of the picture completely because it's being powered by the PC power supply through the cable I made, which is working fine and is not sensitive like the barrel plug over there. So that's out of the picture. This wiring harness is sort of out of the picture. Okay, this wiring harness says right there, a tag I put on it, IOCN7. So this is a 4-pin connector that has one 5 volt line, which is yellow and black, and then this one, white and black, is a ground. And that was powering my Sega I/O board. It hooked up to this pin from the power supply. So the power supply was powering the Sega I/O board, but now, like I said earlier, now it's being powered by the cable I made that comes off of the Naomi that was powering my compact flash unit. It's now powering the JVS I/O. And it does have 4 wires on it, but that's just because when I made the compact flash unit, I wasn't sure if I could get away with just doing 2 wires or if I needed more, so I went ahead and just wired up 4. Just for whatever sake, I'll show this is a Summit Arcade adapter, and you can see it's not green. It's like the regular fiber board color. This is one of the first ones that Summit Arcade made. So you can get these as pre-made or as kits. And so I got it as a kit, and in fact, so long ago I can't remember if I had to buy the components on the board or if they came with the kit. I can't remember if I just bought I might have just been the PCB that I bought, and then he had a parts list for the header and the compact flash unit and the capacitors and everything on there. But so yeah, I built that myself. And yeah, uses 5 volts and ground. So now the JVS I is pulling that 5 volts and ground. So this part of the wiring harness has been eliminated. The rest of this actually kind of serves a purpose. The letters on it, A, B, and C. Some of these go to start buttons. Some of these go to possibly a gun board. I haven't quite... yeah, this one might have gone to a Sega gun board. Yeah, and I've got some other connectors behind me that I had wired with player 1 and player 2, buttons 1 and 2, start buttons, coin meter buttons, enough that you could actually start a game. And, well, it doesn't have joystick connectors because it was for a gun game cabinet. So all you can do is start a game and press fire. So basically, this isn't used, but some of this might end up being used because I need to wire up controls. What I'm going to wire controls up to, I have on order an Undamned USB Decoder, the wired version. And what that does is it takes an arcade fight stick, one of these things, right, made for PS3, PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One. I don't know, there's several others that it also supports. So I borrowed this from the same friend that I borrowed the power supply from. Some of the buttons are kind of intermittently working, he said, and so I'm going to open it up and take a look at it and see if I can figure out what's going on with that. But this should work with the Undamned decoder, because what it does is it takes the USB from one of these sticks and then it converts it into discrete button presses. So what I will do is I'll take that board, and it has a USB in, and then it's got wiring terminals on both sides. So I can wire from that decoder, say for player 1 start, and then connect it to whichever one of these connectors that I've got that has the start buttons on it, that go down to this connector. This connector is buttons and coin meters. This connector is analog controls, right? Spinners, steering wheels, brake pedals, gas pedals, that type of thing. So, like I said, I haven't fully populated this. It's got coin meters and player 1 and 2 start and player 1 and 2 buttons 1 and 2. And I'm routing grounds and 5 volts to some of these because the gun games, the start lights flash when there are credits, so I wanted to have that happen. So I've got start buttons that will flash, they get power, and also an output wire from this connector that tells them when to flash. So yeah, it'll be a separate joystick with USB that doesn't have to be modified in any way, that plugs into the decoder board that I'll be getting, and then the decoder board is going to hook to the I/O board here. So this can all be self-contained, and then when you want to play, you just get your stick out and plug it into that USB decoder, and it'll handle taking the buttons and joystick movements that you make, converting it to the I/O board that then sends over this cable, which is, yes, it's a USB cable, but it's not USB format. It's, just think of it as a 4-pin cable. It sends over the cable into the Naomi the controls that you're using. So button presses go from, which is kind of interesting because, back here again, you press a button on this, right, and there's 2 wires that connect, and it goes to a circuit board in here. So what happens is you physically press a button, that signal then inside this joystick gets converted to a USB signal that the PlayStation or whatever your stick is set to output data to understands. So you physically push a button, that signal gets converted to the USB format, then it'll go into that board that I'm getting that decodes that and turns it back into a button press that goes into the JAMA I/O, which then converts that button press once again, but this time into the signal format that the Naomi understands. So I've asked on a forum, I found somebody that's using some of these boards, and it sounds like it doesn't add enough lag that you'd notice, but I just find it fairly funny that you're going from a physical button press to an encoded signal to a decoded signal to an encoded signal before it actually gets into the hardware. So, not sure what else to say here. In the back there, that's my Tron speaker, which I think I might have had out in the second video, which I didn't bother watching before starting this video, but it's a made by Monster speaker system that came out when Tron Legacy did, that I got on clearance for a good price. And so the output from the audio is going into that. It has its own power supply that needs to go in an outlet. It's an 18 volt power supply, so I'm not going to be able to power that from the PC. So the powered speaker gets plugged into an outlet. The power supply gets plugged into an outlet. And as of now, the VGA to HDMI adapter gets plugged into an outlet, which again I'm pretty sure is just because the barrel plug that I made is not the right format, not the right internal diameter to properly work. So assuming I can get that fixed, find a barrel tip of the right size, assuming that is the problem, then yeah, I'd be down to just 2 power cords, the power supply and the speaker. The speaker is going to stay there, so that's not going to move. But that means that all the rest of this will simply be powered by this power supply and come on with the one switch on the power supply. So it makes it really tidy, and you don't have to have a power supply added to the mix for the Raspberry Pi, and you don't have to have a different power supply for the JVS, and you don't have to have a different power supply, hopefully, for the VGA to HDMI adapter. So, like I said, even though it looks kind of like a mess right now, right, with wires hanging down and wires there, just imagine that this batch of wires only consists of one wire bundle of these type of PC connectors and the main PC line. These two connectors that I made, the one that goes to the Raspberry Pi and the one that goes to the VGA to HDMI adapter, are coming off here. They're really long because I decided I'd rather make it long than have it too short, so I could always coil those up when I figure out the configuration of all this when I'm done, if it's going to go on a board, if I'm going to get maybe a small PC case that I can put the power supply in, lie it on its side, and put the Naomi on top of it instead of this. Same thing here with the VGA cable. This thing is ridiculously long because it's made to run an arcade cabinet where you might have to run the VGA cable from the bottom of the cabinet where the board is to the top of the cabinet where the monitor is. So I could get a smaller VGA cable, so that might get rid of some of this extra wiring slack. The USB cable is the same thing. This is a stock Naomi USB cable, which again, it's not USB format, it's just they chose USB headers probably because it's an existing thing and they didn't have to design their own proprietary connectors. They could just use a USB connector to handle getting those wires from one part to another here. So that USB cable is much longer than it needs to be, so I could get a shorter USB cable when I figure out where that's going to go. These wires here that go from the I/O board and then we'll go to that encoder PCB I get. That there's a piece that I'm thinking of buying that will replace this JVS I/O. There is a Tucson Logic. A guy, I don't know if it's one guy or several guys, but they have made their own I/O board, and it is about a third the size of this JVS I/O, and it has you can connect ribbon cables to it for signals, and basically what I'm thinking of doing is I'll have the arcade stick that goes into that decoder, and then the decoder can go into that smaller I/O board, and that'll get rid of 2/3 of this Sega I/O. It still needs to be powered, that other I/O board, but that's not an issue because I've got this one powered here, so I've got the lines. I can just attach them to the other I/O board, but that will save a lot of space in this direction, and also because I won't be using this connector with these wires, it might save some height because I might be able to wire it up. Well, it's got ribbon cable connectors on them, so it should be a smaller height than that. Those boards are $50, I believe, last I looked. Not much information on them on the web about people using them, so that's why I've kind of held off on that, because I've got a JVS I/O right here and it works. Do I want to spend $50 on something that might introduce more lag than the JVS I/O does? I don't know. I haven't seen any actual technical reviews of its response time or its behavior or oddities or things like that. But the couple things that I have seen make it sound like it's a perfect fit for a setup that I'm trying to do, because I'm not going to be using wheels, steering wheels, driving games, analog controls on this setup. Even though it does support them, I believe you have to put a different firmware onto that board to do analog. But the whole reason I'm doing this is so I can play some of the Naomi games that I like on this PC or this monitor, and playing driving games in here, jury-rigging pedals and figuring out where to put the steering wheel and all that. I don't want to mess with that. So my favorite games are, shooters, shmups, like this one here, like Zero Gunner 2, Under Defeat being my favorite, and those are just those don't use analog controls. So yeah, that other board, the Tucson Logic board, sounds like a really nice idea. Plus, these Sega I/O boards, unless you get lucky, they go for quite a bit when I see them on eBay. Admittedly, I haven't looked recently, although arcade parts recently have been going up in price, but it seems when I was looking for these, a lot of times they were priced at $60, $70, something like that. And yeah, having a $50 option that's a brand new part, that's a much smaller footprint, meaning I can use this on one of my other Naomis. Also on these, sometimes that main chip goes bad. I had one where the chip went bad, and you either have to pull it off of another I/O board, which then of course makes that one not work, or I believe the guy in England that sells a lot of Sega parts sells those for like, I think it's over $20 just for the chip. So having that $50 solution seems like a pretty good option as long as it works as well as the JVS I/O. So I'm definitely going to be looking into that, and probably, most likely, will buy that. And now I've talked so long, I'm up to about 40 minutes on this video, as I usually do, just rambling on. But yeah, that's where I'm at. Like I said, I have eliminated part of this wiring harness. I've got a power supply replacement that's shorter than this one, and just a little bit over half the depth of it. And I've completely eliminated the Raspberry Pi needing a separate power supply. And so a lot of this that still kind of looks all wiry and messy. Oh yeah, the network cable, that's just a spare network cable I had that's obviously way long to go to the Raspberry Pi. Depending on where the Raspberry Pi is going to end up, I could make a smaller power cable. In fact, I was almost thinking of just mounting the Raspberry Pi with some Velcro right here on the metal shield of the NetDim. And then I think I actually still have a crimper and maybe some end pieces for making my own network cable. I might even be able to just cut one of these down and make my own that's just 4 or 5 inches long, that just plugs right in from the NetDim to get rid of all that wiring mess. And then shortening some of the cables. So imagine that most of these cables are gone, and it's starting to look pretty good. That Naomi is almost to the end of the board. This power supply doesn't quite fit to the end of the board. So as far as trying to fit everything onto this board, the power supply would fit, but it'd be hanging off a little bit, so it wouldn't fit within the confines of the board, but it would be able to be mounted to this board without enlarging the board. The Sega I/O could go and take the place of the compact flash unit. The HDMI converter could stick to the Naomi here, or go down here. That decoder I'm going to get could fit down there. So I think technically I am pretty much could get everything to actually be attached to this board. So if I wanted to just put this board somewhere when I'm not playing Naomi games and pull it out when I am, that should work. Although I'd still like to get it tidier than that. One thing that I didn't realize until yesterday also, if you look at my monitor, I've got dual monitors with the monitor stand there. I made sure that my cable width, my cable length, not including the one that I'm running right now from the Naomi, but for the 2 PCs I use this setup on, a work laptop and my primary PC. The cables that go to this monitor allow me to rotate it vertical. And that was important because, like I said, my favorite game on the Naomi is got to be Under Defeat, and that's vertically oriented. So one thing I didn't take in mind, I thought maybe if I get everything on this board, I just put this board right where it is, and then I'm sitting, in my chair here in front of the desk with the controller in my lap or right here on the table, and I can play games. Well, if I've got this rotated vertical, it's going to be lower. It's going to be so low that this Naomi setup, the way it is now, will not fit here. And you'd think, well, wait, you've got a monitor arm, why can't you just move it up further? Well, I could, but this height is about the ideal height for the monitor to be at for me. So if I was to lift it up, it might be a bit of a more of a neck craning type thing to be looking up at the screen than it is now. So I'm thinking that the solution I come up with is better to be one where it goes on the floor there. So I just lean it up against those cupboards to use it. Everything would be bolted to a piece of wood, or like I said, maybe I might make a PC case that holds the power supply and everything but the Naomi. And then the Naomi would lie on top of it. But either way, I think, yeah, the game when I'm playing will be sitting there, which gives me plenty of leg room. I'm not going to be bumping into it or anything. It's right next to the power strip. And all I have to do is plug in the speaker back there, because there's no on-off switch on that one. Well, there might be an on-off switch on that one. I'll have to check. I might be able to leave that on all the time and reach around to the back to turn it on. I know there's a like a touch-sensitive switch in the back that makes those lights that you can see, which are actually white if you look at it in person, kind of white with a slight blue tint. The camera makes them look really blue. Those you can turn off by touching the panel, which I had them off and now they're on, so I don't know if it actually remembers that, or I'd have to reach back and touch that button every time. But I don't think there's a physical on-off, and if there is, it might be on the base. I think it might be on the base. Anyway, it's not easy to get to. So, worst case scenario, what I want to end up doing is plug in the speakers. I'll just leave that. It's the huge power supply deal down there. I'll just leave that there all the time with the audio cord down next to it. And then I could just bring in whatever the Naomi setup is, put it down here in whatever factor, lying flat on a case or on a board leaning up, whatever it ends up being. And then all I have to do is plug the audio RCA jacks into the Naomi, plug the power supply into the power strip, and then figure out what I'm going to do with the HDMI cable. Because right now I am unplugging the HDMI cable that goes to my work laptop and plugging in the Naomi. So I might look into an HDMI switcher. I'm honestly not sure on that, because it isn't that big of a deal to plug and unplug the HDMI cable. So it's kind of judging that up against the pain of getting an HDMI switch box. Where am I going to plug that in? Where am I going to put it so it's not like really obvious where it is, kind of a thing. But anyway, yep, okay, now I'm up to 49 minutes. I should probably shut up now. This is the third video of getting this Naomi to be a much smaller footprint.